Book 2, Chapter 5, Rouge City. In the end, what had he left? This odd assortment of images and memories. Sitting in his dark office, he scanned his relics. Here was one. He remembered that day, his son's second birthday. Ellen had still been alive then. They'd been a family, close and loving. He could barely remember what that meant now. Time had taken the memory from him and replaced it with dead-end traces of things that used to move him, tattered remnants of memories of happier times. And next to that image was another from a time he recalled like yesterday. Even the smells came back to him, sawdust and popcorn, and the sounds of boys laughing and cheering and challenging one another. The boy had struck his first home run that day. His eyes had grown wide in amazement at this feat, and he ran, gazing at the outfield in disbelief as he rounded the diamond. In the photo, the boy smiled a triumphant, beaming pride. And here was another, the boat trip. Let's see, the boy had been about 5, or was it 6? The man chuckled to himself as he remembered the boy's amazement at the big humpbacks that flanked the boat and spouted before tunneling deep into the blue water. It wasn't exactly a happy chuckle. There were more, much more. All of them sad substitutes for the people depicted. But they were all he had left. He could not blame the Swinton woman for what she'd done. He understood. From the moment he'd seen that familiar frustration just beneath the surface of Henry Swinton's face, he'd known that something like this was a possibility. He never should have told him they would destroy the prototype. How stupid of him. The moment the Swinton son had awoken from cryo, the Mecca had become a destabilizing quadrant in the family triad. He should have considered the strength of the imprinting process and the possibility of a severe attachment occurring. She'd cried hard as she told her story, and he'd been so surprised to find out what things his creation had been up to, what human-like thought patterns it had begun to display. And fairy tales. Fairy tales. Amazing. What had they wrought? He wanted to fire the repair crew for not reporting the precise nature of the spinach malfunction. Damn them! It hadn't been a malfunction at all. No, he could not blame Monica. He had once lost love so. His wife had fallen at the hands of a poorly experienced and intoxicated driver. She had left him at a time when he needed her, when he was dependent on her emotional strength. It had been just he and the boy then, and that had been brief. Just years later, his son had succumbed to the insistence of a merciless and systematic killer of children. A disease. A syndrome, really. The Swinton's child had mercifully and inexplicably survived it. The man sat alone in the dark now, remembering all those years ago. He let a tear fall as he gazed on his favorite picture of the boy. He picked up the picture and held it close to his chest in a rare and private display of sadness. The door to his study opened suddenly, and a handful of his team walked in. He stood and wiped his face quickly. They had news. Was it good? Let it be good news. "We found him," one of his men said, as they circled his desk. "Where?" the director asked hesitantly. "In a flesh fair outside Haddonfield," the man responded. The director's face dropped. Oh God, a flesh fair. Those poor misunderstanding people. What had they done? "Is he alive?" he inquired, afraid to hear the response. "Yes," the man replied quickly, hearing the urgency in his boss's voice. "He was in one piece last time he was seen. He was with some rogue lover mecha. They were headed into the forest. They had the Swinton super toy with him." The director was lost for words. The joy that rushed through him was something he was not good at expressing. He held it back as they moved towards the door. But at the last moment he stopped and embraced the man who had told him the news. The man understood and squeezed him back, He loved and respected the director. He knew what losses the man had suffered and the importance of this project to him. They shared a quick moment of relief, and then they left to try to find their lost creation, their most amazing device. As they left, the director placed the image he had held to his chest back in its place. It gazed out on the dark, empty room. At its base, it read, "In loving memory of David." In the photograph was the face of the boy he had helped bring into the world. The boy whom he had loved and nurtured when his mother had been lost. The child whose loss had almost destroyed his own heart, and who he had eventually brought back to life as Mecca. It was the face of the boy who was roaming the dark forest now, looking for a miracle that would make him real. It was some time before the trio stopped running. The mecha never tired, and they moved quickly through the dark forest, as far as 5 or 6 miles before they started to walk. David had picked up Teddy when the small thing started to lag behind he and his new associate. Teddy now rode comfortably on David's back. It had been some time since they heard the sound of Orga in the vicinity. The animals who scampered through the forest and occasionally cried out seemed to be their only company now. Joe watched carefully as the little Orga-looking robot moved with determined strides over the rough and overgrown terrain. He had stopped holding on to Joe's hand some time ago, and now had the small furry thing clinging to him. Occasional glimpses of the boy mecha's face displayed a set, determined look, introspective, very Orga. Joe had no idea where the small mecha was going, but then he had no idea where he was going either. So it seemed fitting to follow him, seeing as the little one's Orga-like screams and whines had effectively set them free. Perhaps this one was good company, and knew more than its appearance implied. It was also dawning on Joe that the little one had saved him from destruction. After some time they came to a clearing in the forest where the night sky was visible. A milky line of stars blinked against the black infinitude above. Teddy looked up, and alarm came upon him. "I see the moon," the bear said. David stopped and looked up also. His eyes adjusted automatically, like an Orga's eyes. He could see it clearly, but he could not discern any Orga men or cages of mecha beneath the moon. Still, they had been fooled before. "Is it real?" he asked, preparing to make a dash in the other direction. Teddy's head whirred as he adjusted his vision. "I don't know, David. It's too far," he said finally. "Is it coming?" David inquired anxiously. "I can't tell yet," Teddy answered. David was uncertain what to do. The tragic episodes of the flesh fair were too fresh in his mind. The destruction of his new friend, the nanny, and the incomprehensible burning and exploding of the other robots. They couldn't know that far behind them, the moon balloon was already being counted as wreckage in the ruin of the flesh fair, and insurance claims were already being calculated by a bandaged and cursing Johnson, who after the Cybertronics men had grilled him on the phone, was only grateful that he'd not destroyed the boy mecha and brought another lawsuit on himself. David did his best to calculate the distance of the moon. If it was really the moon, it was far away and nothing to worry about. If it was not, then it was too close to tread in this direction. "Let's not walk this way," he said, and turned. He passed the man mecha that had been following him. His mind was occupied. He had a quest and did not think about the other that was with him. Joe stood for a moment and gazed at the distant glowing orb. Built to a more specific function, his distance eyes were not as good as David's, or Teddy's. He stared a moment more, and then decided perhaps the little mecha was right. He turned and saw the two strange robots headed back into the gloom of the forest. "Where are we going?" he asked when he caught up with the pair. David did not think of them as we, but he processed the question and decided, yes, they must be together. "We're going this way now," was all he could come up with for an answer, though. "Are you in bad trouble?" Joe asked. "What other reason could the boy be in such a hurry? Perhaps you're running away from someone?" he inquired. My mommy told me to run away, David responded frankly as he walked. This made no sense to Joe. And why did she say that? David started to answer, but then stopped. He'd been so traumatized by the event that he hadn't really tried to understand it. He processed it now and came up with a logical solution. I guess because Henry didn't like me, he said. The alternative was unacceptable. And who is Henry? Joe queried. Henry is Mommy's husband, David explained. Joe understood now. So Henry is your father. And why did your father not— Henry is not my father, David interrupted quickly. Monica's my mommy, and Henry is Mommy's husband, he explained, hoping that would clear things up for the man Mecca. Joe paced quietly beside the boy thing as he processed this. He decided to save it for later. There was upset in the little Mecca's voice, and that was something he had not heard from machines before. And why didn't Henry like you? He asked instead. Because Martin came home, David said weakly. This tale was getting elaborate indeed. And who is he? Joe asked. Martin is Mommy's and Henry's real son, David explained. Just speaking this aloud made him feel weak and cold inside. He was a boy, but he had to be a real boy to make Mommy happy. After I find the blue fairy, he continued, then I can go home. Mommy will love a real boy. The blue fairy will make me into one. Joe thought about this as they coursed through the dark forest. As best he could tell, it made sense. He wasn't really designed to figure out such things. He had a basic vocabulary of reasoning, which was suited to his basic function. He was built specific. The boy Mecha's logic was consistent, but there did seem to be some missing elements. Anyway, he'd never heard of any blue fairy. Is this blue fairy Mecha Olga man or woman? Joe inquired, trying to understand. Woman, David answered. Woman, Joe responded. Very appropriate, he thought. He grabbed the little Mecha's shoulder to slow him down. Then he lifted the little Mecha by the waist and set him down on a fallen tree trunk. David did not fight this, for he knew the man Mecha to be safe, but he did find the handling to be somewhat annoying. He fixed the other with an impatient look, and Teddy grumbled ever so slightly. I know women, Joe said, smiling. David was instantly interested, and his annoyance was forgotten. As he watched, Joe stepped back and nodded his head quickly to the side. Then sound came from him. It was music. A voice was singing. How did he do that? Teddy realized then that the man was a toy. They sometimes ask for me by name, Joe said. And then David and Teddy watched amazed as he jumped quickly on the tree stump beside them and made a strange dramatic pose with his arm on his hip. David did not know about grace or dancing, but he was entranced by the motion. I know all about women, Joe continued. No two are ever alike. And after they'd met me, he moved quickly to the other side of the tree stump and winked at David. No two are ever the same, he concluded. And I know where most of them can be found, he said, raising his eyebrows. David waited for the man to continue, but he said nothing. What a strange way of speaking. David did not know charisma, and probably would not have understood. Where? He inquired finally. Rouge City, Joe replied slowly, punctuating each syllable to stress the importance of this information. And then he moved quickly, placing his hands on two tree stumps, and lifted himself so his feet were suspended in the air. It lies across the Delaware, he explained. He began moving his legs quickly as if he were running. Too much of a feat for our feet, he said. We'll need help to get there. And then he jumped from the tree trunk, landing smoothly on the ground. He moved his head quickly, stopping the music that had issued from him. And it is not without peril, he added ominously, placing his finger on the tip of the Mecha boy's nose, then moving it slowly so the boy and his toy followed it with their eyes. Then he walked to a clearing of trees, pointing towards the glowing orb in the sky. We will have to journey towards the moon, he said. David was mesmerized by the man's way of talking and explaining things. It was like the people in a movie he had watched with Mommy and Martin. Their movements were smooth and grand, different from real people. Are there many women in Rouge City? He asked excitedly. As there are stars in the night, Joe answered with a smile. So many, David thought. And how will we find just one? He inquired aloud. We will ask Dr. No, Joe explained. There's nothing he doesn't. He offered his hand to David then, and waited for the boy to join him. David thought hard about this. The man seemed to know a lot about the world. He'd never even heard of Rouge City. And who was Dr. No? Finally he rose and walked hesitantly towards the other. Joe placed his arm around David's shoulder, and they began to walk quickly towards the moon. The man had a strange bouncing gait, and David looked at his feet from time to time, wondering at the reasons for this. Joe was glad to have a destination. He was glad to have a focus and purpose, not to mention his excitement at the many customers he'd encounter in Rouge. After all, that's what he'd been designed for. He was also glad to be with the little Mecca, and this was strange to him. He felt something new and unusual as they walked, his arm draped over his two new companions. Check that. Very warm, very friend. Exactly what name do you give this woman? Joe inquired, genuinely curious, but also desiring conversation with his new companion. David thought for a moment. She's just Blue Fairy, he replied finally. Blue Fairy, Joe repeated, savoring the words. In the world of Olga, blue is the color of melancholy, he explained. David did not know melancholy, but he listened rapidly to the more experienced Mecca. Yet the services I provide will put a blush back on anybody's cheek, Joe explained to the little Mecca. I will change the color of your fairy for you, he said excitedly, thinking of the conquests that lie ahead in Rouge City. She'll scream out in the moonlight. Oh yes! Oh God! Oh yes! He said, panting in mimicry of the many Olga women he'd serviced. David watched the man Mecca curiously. He did not understand this at all. Teddy was equally perplexed. What good would it do to change the color of the blue fairy, and why would she need to breathe that way? Then Joe stopped and opened his hands as if presenting David a gift. She will make you a real boy, for I will make her a real woman, and all will be right with the world, he said, and looked seriously at his new friend. Because you held my hand and saved my brain. Then he stepped backwards into a clearing as David watched. So once again my customers can ask for me by name? Gigolo Joe, what do you know? He concluded, and did something quick with his feet. David approached the strange Mecca and looked curiously at his feet. Why do you do that? He asked. Joe shrugged. It's just what I do, he said plainly, and executed another quick movement of his feet in which David saw the pattern. So, they call you Gigolo Joe? He asked. My customers call me so, but you can just call me Joe, and I will call you? I'm named David, Joe, and this is Teddy, David said, happy to find someone who seemed to know the world. He reached out and did shake with Joe. Hello, Joe, Teddy said. He realized that Joe was a toy he'd not seen before. He wondered what it was used for. It's good to meet you too, Teddy, Joe said. Now follow me, you two, and don't fall behind. Joe turned and began to strut briskly over a fallen log and into the forest towards the moon. David followed quickly with Teddy on his back. All roads lead to Rouge, Joe said, remembering the city of his birth. Don't they just say that, he laughed. Don't they just, he repeated, and executed a quick jump, clicking his heels together. David moved quickly to catch up with Joe, whose funny strut and strange manner made being with him exciting in some new fashion. David didn't understand all Joe's words, or the smooth rhythmic movements he made, but he felt safe in his company, and there was a new expectation in David's mind. They would go see Joe's friend, Dr. No, and he would show them where the Blue Fairy lived. And then David would find her, and... He smiled for the first time that night, realizing what lay ahead of him. He stepped up and walked beside Joe, who laughed and wrapped his arm protectively around David's shoulders. And the forest was a much less gloomy place. As the trio traveled through the night, the wood began to clear slowly. Soon David could hear the high-pitched whine of motors in the distance, and he saw occasional spots of light through the density of trees. Joe's determined strut had brought them quickly to a place where cruisers went back and forth over the long roads that Olga had built to tie their cities together. They had arrived finally at a clearing of trees beside one of the great roads. David was taken at once by the grand expanse of open space, the feeling of the wind against the receptors in the flesh of his face, the vastness of the dark environment that lay around them, and the multitude of twinkling lights all across the horizon. This was the first time he had stood in an area so vast, the first time he had seen the night world that Olga had created for themselves. Even in the distance, it was an impressive sight. They walked for some time beside the freeway, and then, as fortune would have it, they came upon a cruiser that was sitting still beside the road. You wait here, David. I will talk to them, Joe said, leaving his new friends under the shadow of trees beside the road. He approached the cruiser cautiously, The events of just hours ago were not, and would never be, forgotten by any of them. Jade didn't feel like dealing with any beggars tonight. "Damn it," he said as he caught a glimpse of the stranger approaching from the darkness of the trees. "It's probably some vagabond." He leaned out of the cruiser door and yelled at the boy who was working on it. "Kurt, man, you want to hurry up back there?" Bear came to life in the back seat. "What's up? What's wrong?" he inquired, his curly mane of blonde hair bouncing around as he craned his neck to see what had disturbed Jade. "You got any change, man?" Jade said. "There's some guy out there." But then he caught a glimpse of the exotically dressed stranger and kept his tongue as the man walked to the door and leaned through the window. "Gentlemen," Joe started, "pardon my intrusion on your misfortune, but my partner and I have been misplaced." Jade interrupted Joe quickly and patted his hands against his pockets. "Hey, sorry, man, no change. We're just trying to get going here." Then he leaned to the window and yelled, "If my friend ever gets his thing going!" The boy behind the cruiser ignored this, and Joe continued, "We're not so interested in your money, gentlemen, as we are in expediting our journey." Joe gestured to the shadows behind him. "My young friend and I headed to Rouge City, and if you could see your way to assisting us, I would make sure it was worth your efforts." "Hey, you're Mecca," the fuzzy-haired boy in the back seat said. Jade, who had been trying to ignore what he assumed was a beggar, looked more closely at the man in the window. Wow, he was Mecca, a new one, too. The smoothness of his face gave him away, but not much. "Well, we really weren't going that way," Jade said, but it was not very convincing. He'd heard of Rouge City, but didn't know it that well. On the other hand, Joe knew Orga boys very well. He leaned closer to the window. "There are girls in Rouge City, girls of your age who are just like me," Joe said with a conspiratorial smile on his lips. "We are the guiltless pleasures of the lonely human being, and those just out to have some fun," he added with a wink. As he spoke, the other boy came from behind the cruiser and sat in the driver's seat. "You're not going to get us pregnant or have us to supper with Mommy and Daddy," Joe continued. He had their attention now. "We work under you, we work on you, and we work for you," he said. "Man made us better at what we do than was ever humanly possible." He slipped a hollow pen from his pocket. "Now if you can manage us a ride to Rouge City." He clicked on the pen, and an enticing holographic image of a young girl began dancing on the headrest of the seat. All this. Joe shifted the pen down slowly, and the image was suddenly dancing in Jade's crotch. "And much, much more can be yours," he concluded. Jade's face lit up with a knowing smile. "Hop in," he said, without thinking anything more about it. The other boys did not protest this decision. All roads lead to Rouge indeed, and the roads to Rouge are always alive. Into and on through the deep of the night, the lights of Orga cruisers line the thoroughfares across the risen rivers, into the great city and what awaits there. Driven by appetites obscure and profane, grandiose and mundane, they come. Joe had been there at his inception. He had worked alongside the best-built mecca of his type. Lover models that made even him look cheap. Ones that worked in houses only the wealthy could afford. Joe had loved Rouge in his own way. When he'd been sold and reissued at Haddonfield, though, he hadn't been so disturbed about it. There were women everywhere, and everywhere they were, women were women. He serviced them in whatever location and whatever manner they desired. But Rouge was the main playground of his kind, the place that was built, as he had been, specific to its purpose. The place where Orga came from miles inland and from young islands to enjoy the services that Joe and his kind provided. Rouge lies on the horizon now. The bridges that span the Delaware entered the city through the gaping mouths of giant statue faces, women's faces, and those of ambiguous sexuality. Their mouths held open a suggestion of what lay ahead. Beyond the gates, the city glittered a lurid promise against the night. Welcome to Rouge, the city that never blinks. David sat in the front of the cruiser, between two of the Orga boys. The teens were too excited to be concerned with the little boy and his super toy, nor did they find it strange that Joe would be taking one so young, in the middle of the night, to a place like Rouge. They only imagined what a time was in store for them when they arrived. and their imaginings were about to be realized, for they had come to the gates. "Say ah!" the driver said as the cruiser raced into the entrance of the great statue's mouth. And they all joined in. Their voices rose to a crescendo as they entered the tunnel. All that is, except David and Teddy. They were on a mission, and the boy's mind was elsewhere. Could she live here? Could this be the place where he'd find her? The Orga boys and Joe were laughing among themselves, as David felt a reminder of the loneliness that drove him. Joe quickly dispensed of the teens by escorting them to a place at the lower levels of the city where their interests might better be served. It was a dimly lit place along a stretch of the parking corridor, where young-looking mechas stood in sultry poses. This place was worked by mostly dated models, but they were fast and affordable, which Joe was sure would fit the restless young Orga's needs. The boys didn't give he or David a second thought as they approached the girls, and Joe chose this opportunity to make his leave. "Let's be on our way, David," he whispered, "and leave these young Orga to their negotiations." He took David by the hand and led him quickly, back through the parking tunnels, past the hollow shows and old-fashioned film theaters that lined the lower corridors, alongside the family-style restaurants. They made their way along the main access ramp, and then up the escalator into the central plaza. David's processors immediately went to work, sorting out the barrage of sights and sounds around him. He'd never seen anything like this. So much noise, so many lights, and people. There was a loud booming sound coming from the walls around him. Was this music? Well, yes, it seemed to be. The buildings were bathed in intense lights of various colors that changed and gyrated, and there were people everywhere, moving quickly, laughing and talking among themselves. In one of the rooms they passed through, David saw people making strange rhythmic gestures as they faced one another. What were they doing, he wondered. He stopped and pulled on Joe's arm, pointing with a question in his eye. Joe turned and saw what had caught the little mecha's attention. "That is dancing, David," he explained over the music. Then he executed a quick shuffle of his feet. "It's just what they do," he added, when he saw that David's confused expression hadn't changed. "It's how Orga sometimes prepare for our services," he said, without explaining what our services were. David glanced over his shoulder at the dancing couples as Joe grabbed his hand and led him away. These living things, he wondered. What was it they sought? "They also drink and ingest all manner of trendy amusements," Joe explained. "And when they're ready for us, they come." He stopped then and fixed David with an odd look. "Outside of that, David, we don't mean anything to them, you know. There is our function, and then there is—" He didn't finish this thought. It was outside of his processing, but it had come to him somehow at the flesh fair, as he'd watched the rejects being beaten and burnt. And then there was the old silver mecha that was changing the broken streetlights, smashed in the process of doing its job. Since then, something had been poking up here and there in his head. Something undefined, but real. And when had it formed into a thought? Wasn't it when the little mecha had taken his hand in the cage? He knelt beside David. "But you're not built for these reasons, are you, David?" he said. "You know nothing of this Orga appetite save what you have seen here tonight." He leaned close to David and seemed to examine his face. "You are better, David," he said. "Better for your innocence." David did not know how to respond, or even if Joe's statement needed a response. He held Teddy a little tighter against his chest and then placed his free hand in Joe's. "What about your friend, Dr. No?" he asked. "That's it," Joe said, taking David's hand again. "Never stray from the path. Keep the program intact." He laughed and began his strut again, and quickly they were out in the main plaza. This place was even more of a spectacle. Above them, large holographic displays and gravity-resistant signs floated everywhere, between the looming towers about them, advertising the pleasures to be experienced in Rouge City. Pussycats and bondage, in a place where angels and devils would amuse and be amused. David did not understand any of this, but the sheer sight and size of it kept him busy recording it all. This place was very different from the way Mommy and Henry had lived. People moved hurriedly in every direction. Where were they all going? As they walked, Joe began to point out strangely lit buildings shaped in the fashions of people sitting and squatting and lying down. "There's here Kitty, Kitty," he said, as they passed a crowded glass enclosure. Atop the door, a holographic woman with a tail and a cat's whiskers danced strangely. David did not know sexy and would not have understood. "That's where the agency held my trials when I was made new," Joe said. The images from his awakening are still clear in his mind. The horrific events of the flesh fair, though remembered, are left behind as he relived his introduction to the world, remembering his early conquests and the delight of satisfying his customers. He does not think about Samantha Bevins. He does not think about his missing license. He has put aside the prospect of bad trouble for now. "That's Tails," he said, pointing to a large blue-lit building across the crowded plaza. "Very hoity-toity," he added sarcastically. David did not know sarcasm, nor did he know hoity-toity, but he was amazed at the size of the giant robot that danced on the roof display. It was dressed like Joe. Its movements were smooth and rhythmic like Joe's. It took off its top hat and smiled down at the crowd as it turned gracefully and shuffled its feet, beckoning the restless throng. The extended end of its coat swung smoothly behind it, like a tail. "Only Sunrise Gents and Sunset Ladies there," Joe added. "Strictly Sierra-class robots who have no idea how to live." Joe winked at his companion. "They can't even speak English," he said. "They're all made in Sweden. Couldn't tell a joke from a poke," he laughed, and then jumped away from David, executing a precise duplication of the movements the giant robot in the display had made. David wondered what the difference between a joke and a poke was, but then he decided that it didn't really matter. He watched Joe dance for a moment, and then looked away. Joe was becoming part of it all the noise and distractions around him. A cold feeling came upon him then. These sensations were new to him. Anger and irritation were things that his kind had not been exposed to, and he did not recognize them for what they were. He was getting irritated at all the noise and people. They had nothing to do with him or the Blue Fairy. He was getting angry with Joe for being distracted from the quest. He'd come here for a reason. Where was Dr. No? How come Joe was taking him to all these other places? And then he saw her. Joe was saying something behind him. There was something he wanted David to see, some other distraction. But David's mind had returned suddenly to his quest. Before him, a face was looming above the throng. Gentle, serene. She was bathed in a blue light. It was the same blue lights as Martin's bedroom that night. Did this mean something? He walked slowly towards her. The crowd parted as he passed, too preoccupied in their pursuits to notice this little boy, which they all would have assumed was one of their kind. She protruded from the wall of a building where Olga was shuffling in and out. Her face was downcast, trance-like, beautiful. She had wings. This must be... Are you her? He asked the silent woman on the wall. The statue did not respond, for it was not her. It was not alive. That's Our Lady of the Immaculate Heart, Joe explained as he stepped up beside David. He looked up at the stone face above the neon-lit church. Save the cross and banner, the building was indistinguishable from any other establishment in the city. This was surely not the Blue Fairy that David sought. Joe moved beneath the statue and turned to face David. He leaned against a lamp near the entrance, and posing dramatically, for he could do nothing without style, explained the lady. The ones who made us are always looking for the ones who made them. They go in, fill their hands, look around their feet, sing songs, and when they come out, it's usually me they find. For it is what I do for them that is the reason they come here in the first place. He paused there to let David understand. But David did not, nor did he care. If this was not the Blue Fairy, then it was time for him to go find her. I picked up a lot of business on this spot, Joe added with a wink. Being filled with the spirit must not be enough. They must be filled by something else. An Olga woman suddenly exited the building. Joe watched a shapely figure pass by. Yes, he was back in Rouge, all right. Check that. Analyze. Pursue. He stepped up behind the woman, and with a nod of his head, his body began to sing as he initiated the chase. "But Joe," David called, "where's the blue fairy?" Joe stopped short. Ah, yes, the blue fairy. Had he forgotten so quickly? This was more difficult for him than David knew. He was defying his basic programming, all the codes and signals in his brain that told him to pursue this woman. With a nod of his head, he flicked off his music centers and turned to face the boy who had saved him. David walked to Joe and looked at him accusingly. "What about the blue fairy, Joe?" he asked more firmly this time. "Don't do that again," is what his eyes said. An unspoken understanding passed between them as Joe smiled down at the boy. Recrimination understood. "Well, that's what we're going to find out when we ask Dr. No," he said, putting his arm out for David to take. "That's where everyone goes who needs to know." David was here for a reason. She was a fairy whose whereabouts they had yet to learn. Joe was here for a reason, too. His reason was clasping his hand, creating new and inexplicable thoughts in his single-minded processor. "Meet the good doctor," Joe said, after they'd walked some distance across the crowded plaza. David looked in the direction that Joe had pointed and saw the sign. The lit-up face on the side of the building had fuzzy hair and big glasses, and its smile was wide and welcoming. David did not know Einstein, but he knew the face in the sign was aged, and that among Orga, age was a symbol of wisdom. At the door, he felt a sudden surge of anticipation, and he stopped. It was really happening, wasn't it? They were getting closer. He could feel it. Joe didn't understand why David was waiting at the entrance. He looked back quizzically. Was something wrong? Then the little mecha's face lit up, and he stepped excitedly into the good doctor's office.